Welcome to Uptown Rumble, heavy music in the Bronx. My name is Stephen Payne, director of the Bronx County Historical Society. Today is June 2nd, 2024, and here for an oral history with someone who really needs no introduction, Parris Mayhew, the architect of the sound of the Cro-Mags and really New York hardcore in general, and really incredible musician. Very honored and happy that Parris is participating in this project. One of multiple legendary guitarists to come out of the Bronx. So, Parris, thank you. And why don't you start off? Let's take it to the Bronx and start off by talking about your family history and background and how your family ended up in the Bronx, whatever you might know about that history.
I mean, my grandmother and my aunt, they all lived a block apart on Davidson Avenue in the Bronx. And my mom went to St. Nicholas de Tolentine. I went to St. Nicholas de Tolentine. It was multi-generational. It, I don't, I had uncles and cousins and all kinds of people living all around. We were always just getting on the subway and visiting people or walking to visit people, relatives. So there was like a big Irish contingent of Fitzsimons, which was my grandmother's side, all in the neighborhood. So, I mean, that was just our life. I loved growing up in the Bronx. It was amazing. I just, there were so many kids to play with. It was oddly enough very safe in the same way that, living in Staten Island near mafiosos is safe, or if you lived on Third Street in Manhattan in the early '80s when the Hells Angels were there, that was the safest block. But it was similar to that in our neighborhood because of the Savage Skulls.
Ah,
Basically, they protected all the kids, and if anything ever happened, it was amazing how they united as a force. And like one time I got my bike stolen. I was just out in front of my house, and next thing you know, I was surrounded by kids, older kids, like probably, I guess to judge, I'd say they were, late teens. And they just took my bike and went off. And I turned around and started walking towards my building. And like one of the Savage Skulls was like, "What happened? What's the matter?" And I was like, "Oh, these kids took my bike." And they said, "Really, which way did they go?" And they were easy to identify because they were from a rival gang called the Black Spades.
Black Space,
They were
sure.
wearing colors. And this guy just ran off and gathered up, I don't know, 50 kids. And they went off, and they came back about an hour later with my bike
Wow.
with no explanation of like how they got it back, but I'm just sure they found the kids and pummeled them. Back then it was like gang fights were with fists and maybe stickball bats, and there were no
Sure,
guns or knives or anything, or at least
sure.
not I saw because I was a little kid. But yeah, I loved growing up in that neighborhood. It felt safe. You were always out on the street with like 50 other kids, and your parents would let you stay out late because everybody, you felt safe because there was a real sense of community.
What was the cross street of the building you grew up in? Davidson and what?
North,
Okay, okay, I see. And
about
um,
2 or 3 blocks north of 183rd Street, where the
I
subway station
see.
was.
I see. And you mentioned that the Black Spades, I guess invading that neighborhood, which was run by Savage Schools. Were there other gangs that you remember growing up having a presence in neighborhoods around you, or have any run-ins with them?
There was only one really because the Black Spades were like a Brooklyn gang. So the fact that they were even in our neighborhood was unusual. Like in Brooklyn, there was the Black Spades and the Golden Guineas, and in the Bronx, there was the Savage Skulls, which was the biggest gang in the city at the time, supposedly around 10,000 members.
Yeah.
But there was an Irish gang in our neighborhood called the Loring Boys,
Ah, okay,
and
sure.
right down off Fordham Road, just when you're getting on the Major Deegan, is Loring, and that's where they were from. And I remember like one particular story where we interacted with the Loring boys, which is funny because they were an Irish gang. And I was a little Irish kid. I mean, half Spanish, but the Savage Skulls kids always called me Spick and Span. But one time, me and this guy, this Savage Skull named Big John. I don't remember why we were over there, but we were, it wasn't that far from our neighborhood, but it was far enough. And we were sitting at a bus stop, I think, right by Loring Place, and all these kids started like circling us, riding by on bikes and yelling shit out, like mostly Spick to
Yeah,
John,
sure.
and you fucking Spick, get out of our neighborhood type thing. And I'm just like sitting there. I mean, I must have been 7 years old,
Yeah.
and he's probably 15 or 16. I have no idea. Anyway, so we're sitting at this bus stop, and it starts to get pretty heated. Like, these guys are uh, getting closer and closer, and there's more and more of them. And none of them stuck around. They just kind of like, then they kind of disappeared. And then all of a sudden, like, bang, out of like nowhere, because we were sitting on this bench by a bus stop, which was up against like a stone wall that must have been, I don't know, 8 feet high or something. And then at the top of the stone wall was a park.
Uh-huh.
So what we didn't realize was they were creeping up behind us. And they one of them, I didn't see it happen. All I felt it was it hit my head, but they dropped a cinder block down, and it hit John on the shoulder. It like bounced off his shoulder and hit me in the head. And I just was like, I just toppled over, and just blood. I was just covered in blood.
Wow.
Yeah. John just flipped the fuck out. And just as this kid was, I could, like see this kid going by on a bike, yelling shit out. And John just like bolted and grabbed the kid and just started pummeling him in the middle of the street, like screaming, like, you know, and then he ran back to me and basically threw me over his shoulder and started trying to get out of the neighborhood. But all these kids were coming by with bikes, winging bottles at us, and
Wow.
and we had to figure out a way to get me home. And he ran basically the whole way, and got to where where we live. And of course, he just like set me down on a car and went running around the neighborhood and gathered up, reinforcements. And then he basically walked me back to Loring Place. And then there's like 100 of these kids just went around one at a time, picking off Loring boys. And I was just kind of like their mascot because I was a little kid, because they had this thing. It was like we were all the little kids in the neighborhood. We were in the junior division.
Sure, sure.
Junior division. We had jackets and stuff. I think, but we were certainly not like participating in those activities. But yeah, so the Loring Boys was the only other gang that I ever encountered besides the Black Spades. And the other time we encountered the Black Spades was I was with Big John again, and we used to play in all these abandoned buildings because there were so many abandoned buildings in our neighborhood, and there was this one that was it was a 2-story building, and we had taken it over. It's like our clubhouse, and like we had all gone in there and with pipes and hammers and tore all the walls out on the first floor. So it was basically one big floor. And then we tore out the staircase so you couldn't get to the second floor. And then we built a ladder in one of the closets, and dug a hole in the floor so you could get to the second floor only if you knew how to get there. And we would, get any mattress we found in the garbage, and we had piled them all up on the side of the building. So there was like 30 mattresses out there, and we would jump off the roof onto the mattresses. We would jump out the windows. It was just like a fun thing to do, city thing to do.
Sure,
And
sure.
one day, me and Big John were walking towards the clubhouse, and we could see like 10 Black Spades coming down the street, and they saw John. Of course, they wouldn't have even noticed me because I was just a kid, but they noticed John with his colors on, and John just says to me, "Run!" And it was like one of those things where they were just past the clubhouse and we weren't quite there yet, so we had to run towards the clubhouse because running away I would definitely would have gotten caught. So we ran into the clubhouse and we went straight to that closet and up the stair, up the ladder. And when we got to the second floor, there was a closet in there, and he just like threw me in the closet and covered me with like all kinds of debris and garbage and shit, whatever was up there. And then he jumped out the window and ran. So he left me there, which, it wasn't like he left me there. It was like the only way to get away. And
Sure.
so these guys came running in, and you could hear them downstairs. Like when John was gone, I could hear them running around. And of course once John jumped out the window, we started yelling at him and stuff. So they got distracted and chased him off. And I just stayed in that closet for, I don't know, 10 minutes or something, and then came out. And then later on, I ran into John, and everything was fine. So that was like one of the rare times those guys came into the neighborhood. But one final Black Spades story was I was living in LA in 1999, and I used to go to this all night gym, and like 24-hour gym. And I was in there, and there was nobody else in there. And all of a sudden this guy comes walking in, and I was like hitting the bag or something. And I remember I wasn't really paying attention. He kind of eased his way up really closely, and he said something like, he goes, "Who is that you're hitting?" He goes, "It looks like it's very specific." I was like, "Yeah, maybe." And then we just started chatting, and he was like, "Oh, you don't sound like you're from LA." I was like, "No, I'm not. I'm from New York." He's like, "Really? I'm from New York too." He goes, "Where'd you grow up?" I was like, "In the Bronx." He goes, "Oh, I grew up in Brooklyn." And I was like, "Oh yeah." And then he offhandedly mentioned that he was in the Black Spades. And there was this like weird moment for like 15 seconds where we were both, I was like, "Yeah, I used to hang out with the Savage Skulls." It was like this like little moment that you had to laugh about, because it was being 30 years later. And I'm glad I did, because like the guy didn't seem like he would I wouldn't have wanted to have a middle of the night brawl with him at the gym. Remember his name. It was such a funny encounter. And we ended up, hanging out and talking all night, yeah, not all night, but like while we were at the gym, we just kept talking about living in New York in the 60s and the 70s, which was a very different time, a fun time, Wild West time. I mean, I always say, I'm married now, so I love the fact that my wife can walk down the street and, at night and come home, and everything is very different. But I definitely miss the Wild West of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. What other things would you do for fun around the neighborhood? Obviously, there's the things like jumping out windows onto mattresses, but what kind of street games and all would you play?
Stickball, stickball was a big game, and alleys, just exploring all the alleys, knowing ways to get from one place to another in the neighborhood that if somebody came from outside the neighborhood wouldn't be able to follow you or figure out, that kind of thing. Like we were always like doing maneuvers, and and we always played roundup.
Oh, sure, sure.
And oh yeah, there were also all these like crazy things going on at the time. Like there was like once a year, there was this thing called Kill White Boy Day. It's like, you wouldn't go out of the street on that day. I mean, uh, what else did we do? I mean, we were always doing stuff. We were always on roofs. We were always, I
Sure.
mean, there were always abandoned cars in the neighborhood. There was this one kid in our neighborhood named Carl who would love to, around Christmas time, he would just jam every thrown away Christmas tree into these abandoned cars and then close the window and set it on fire. That kind of,
Yeah, sure.
playing in abandoned buildings, like having club. I call it playing because we were little kids, but everybody just hung out in these abandoned buildings. And skateboarding. Oddly enough, I remember getting my first skateboard when I lived in the Bronx. It had metal wheels. We
Wow.
basically took a pair of metal roller skates that like separated at the center with a bolt, and you just take it apart and then bolt those to the bottom of a board. Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Growing
Um,
up, growing up in the Bronx was a great fun time. But I probably, in a lot of ways, I've said, I probably got out of the Bronx just at the right time because I was in Catholic school, and I think I left Catholic school before I got ripe enough for the priests.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
and also got out before it, you know, the street life there got too out of control. I mean, so many of the kids that I grew up with, like Big John, ended up in prison, and he died in prison.
Wow.
And, yeah,
How old were you when you moved out of the Bronx for the last time? I don't know if you moved around at all, but
you know, there was we were having family turmoil, and my dad basically took us and ran away with us. We lived down south, oddly enough, for 5 years, traveling around in a carnival. You know, because
wow.
my dad was a kid, he was a carny, and so he knew how to maneuver around, you know, and be on the move but earn a living. So that's what we did for 5 years, and then and he was also dodging some statute of limitations for something that he had done in Nashville, and then where he lived, and then when that statute of limitations was up, he went back. He wanted to take us to Nashville, and we lived there for a year, and then I said that I wanted to go back and live with my mother because I thought it was the right thing, that she had been without us for 5 years and had no idea where we were.
Yeah.
It was pretty traumatic, terrible situation. So I went back to New York, but by that time she had left the Bronx. My grandmother had left the Bronx. She had moved up to Hartsdale, like, to retire, and
All
my
right.
mom had moved into Manhattan. So my return to home it was very disjointed and strange. You know, I always imagined, when we left, I didn't even think that we'd be gone very long,
Sure.
like a week. We didn't take anything with us. We just literally got in the car and drove away, and we're gone for 5 years. But when you're a little kid, you measure time in different kinds of increments, like in half-hour increments, like, because that's how long a television show is, or the day is broken up by when you get out of school at 3 o'clock. Those You have these very short-term senses of time and interims, and so when we left, the idea of 5 years wasn't really even something I could fathom. That was already half my life.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So how old were you when you left for that 5 year period?
9.
9. I see. I see. Wow.
And then
Um,
I got back to New York when I was 14.
I see. I see. So to keep it in the first 9 years of your life for just a little bit longer, what some of the if you know if you have like distinct memories of this, what's some of the music that you remember hearing on the street or in your home during the first 9 years of your life?
Well, I remember that vividly because music was such a big thing. The Jackson Five.
Sure.
The Jackson Five was the singular most important band to all the kids on the street. There were these, right, not on North, but the next street south, which I can't recall at the moment, on Davidson Avenue. There were these two girls that lived on the first floor named Kathleen and Doreen, and they used to um, take their record player and put it out on like a box and plug it in through the window, and
Huh?
everybody would bring their singles over, and I had like Rockin' Robin and Dancing Machine on singles,
Sure.
and other kids would bring other records, but we would stand on that street corner and dance to like the Jackson Five, over and over. Just play Dancing Machine over and over and over for hours, because little kids are, they just like, okay, let's play it again.
Yeah.
Rocking around, we'd all just like dance like kids on the street, and that was the single most important one. And I remember like having very serious kid conversations on the street corner, like, man, I bet Michael Jackson can't fight. Man, fuck that kid. He can sing, but man, I bet he can't fight. Which was like the most, that was currency.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Oh,
Corner.
is it Evelyn Place? I was trying to think of the
That
street.
sounds right. That sounds
Yeah,
right.
yeah, 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 yeah.
But yeah, that was currency, and we thought Michael Jackson was lacking in that street currency, but he could sing. And who else? The Ohio Players.
Oh, sure.
Everybody loved the Ohio Players, and I mean all the bands from that. All the there were so many great. The music was just so fantastic back then. You just turned on the radio and everything was wonderful. But the Jackson Five were certainly the primary for us, at least.
Sure. Sure. Um, and well, obviously you heard plenty of such a wide variety of things on the radio because that's how the radio was at the time. But do you remember um, some of the first songs that had electric guitar that struck you?
I mean, I do remember because I had this like little radio with like a little knob, and you click it on, and then that would be the volume knob.
Yeah.
And I remember always hearing the Doors on the
Uh-huh.
radio. Uh, like "Come On Baby, Light My Fire" was a big hit, and like every time you turn the radio, it was on. And yeah, at that time, that's probably the only rock band I remember because there was so much stuff that cluttered up popular radio. Like I remember always hearing Neil Sedaka. I
Sure.
remember always hearing the Partridge Family on the radio and the Doors and just odd one-hit songs. Like I remember there was this one song that's so funny. I don't never heard it again. I guess it got canceled, but it went, "Young girl, get out of my mind. I'm telling you, it's way out of
Oh
line.
yeah, sure, sure.
Young girl, you're much too young, girl." I mean, but that was on the radio every day, like right with the Doors.
Yeah, yeah,
And I'm around my house. My mom listened to the Beatles and Janis Joplin and yeah, mostly the Beat and Hendrix. And
sure.
my dad was into country music, but he wasn't really living with us at that time.
I
Not
see.
until not until we left the Bronx, because
Sure.
it was kind of like my. That's another long story before that, but my parents had broken up before that.
I see. I see.
Bobby
So
Bobby Womack, I remember hearing a lot of,
yeah, Bobby Womack. Yeah, wow. Um,
and of
so
course,
go
uh,
ahead.
Kiss hadn't happened yet, but Ace is from the Bronx.
That's right.
He's
That's
Puerto
right.
Rican.
Yeah, Ace. I mean, yeah, Ross the Boss Friedman from the Bronx too. Um, yeah, uh, Jimmy Hazel, yourself, a lot of really phenomenal guitarists. Um, but when you were on the 5 year road trip with your dad, what kind of music were you being exposed to during that period?
I mean, I remember at some point, like when we left the carnival, we were trying to drive from Florida to LA. We were going to just try to go to LA, you know, because I think the carnival season had ended, and we needed to do something. And so my dad put all the Carney stuff in a storage room, and we started driving west. And we ended up having to stay in Texas for a while because we ran out of money. And I just remember vividly that it was around the time that Skinner crashed, and that was such a thing, like a phenomenon in Texas. Like everybody was just like mourning, like as if the president was assassinated or something. And I remember in that era hearing the Eagles and Skinner and all that Southern rock stuff, and ZZ Top, of course. I mean, we saw my dad took us to see ZZ Top in Galveston on our way, like we were still driving west.
Wow.
We saw it was Charlie Daniels, ZZ Top, and Foghat
Wow.
on the beach in Galveston, like on a stage set up on the sand.
What year would that have been? If
It
or
was
about what year, I guess.
probably that transition between 76 and 77, or maybe
Yeah,
7.
yeah, yeah.
And then,
Wow.
and endlessly driving in the carnival, you're listening to the radio all the time. So I started being exposed to a lot of rock and roll music. And then when the whole thing in Texas didn't work out, we lived in Texas for I think around a year in Houston, in a trailer park in East Houston. It was just like very crazy time. But we then went to Nashville, and that was when I started having my first concert experiences. Like in one summer, we saw so many bands. We saw the Kinks,
Wow.
Van Halen, Aerosmith, uh, Ted Nugent, the Cars, the Police, with the English Beat opening. And I mean, me and my brother. I told this story before, but me and my brother, there was a record store there. I think it was called The Great Escape, And we would just walk into the record store and we would say to the guy behind the counter, we're like, can we see the concert tickets? And he's like, I'll just tell you who's playing. And we were like, no, we have to look at the ticket. He's like, why? Because we have to see how the name looks on the ticket because we didn't know any of the bands.
Sure.
So we would just hold the ticket up and we would go, hmm, Rush. That sounds good. And we'd buy the ticket. I still have all those ticket stubs and all the tickets that we bought that summer were $6.50.
Wow.
So I saw Kiss that summer on, for $6.50. I saw Rush, and yeah, it was amazing. So that was really kind of like it all came in a flood. Steve Miller Band. That was the first concert we saw that summer was the Jackson Five. Oddly enough,
Oh, I see. Full circle. Wow. Yeah.
it was the final tour before Michael Jackson went solo, and it wasn't a big venue. It only held like 3,000 people. It was called the Municipal Auditorium.
Wow.
And, so we saw the Jackson Five, and that was fantastic. But subsequently, we started, doing that trip to the record store and just reading the names off. And we knew who Aerosmith was from the radio. That was like, you could not know who Aerosmith was in that time. And we knew who Steve Miller Band was, but we didn't know who Rush was. And a bunch of the other tickets we just bought because we liked the name on the ticket.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
that was a big formative thing. And my dad was in the music business. He was a record producer, but he hadn't been doing that for quite a while because of this whole family experience where we were just on the run, kind of. And but when he landed in Nashville, he tried to pick up his music career as a producer, a songwriter, publisher. And he had been a promoter in the 50s. That's he encountered and worked with Jack Clement and Patsy Cline and Roy Clark, and he discovered Johnny Paycheck, the singer. He was one of his primary uh, discoveries and finds, and he made him a star.
Yeah.
And that all began to, all that kind of stuff that he had. Probably the highlight of his career was all before the Bronx.
That's right. So,
Yeah. He also worked, you know, in New York, in Tin Pan Alley, with all the songwriters and stuff. And he produced a lot of jazz stuff. He did some Charlie Parker, and
wow.
he owned Charlie Parker Music. And he did some kind of deal that got him some clout at this small record label in New York because he wanted to be in the music business. And that got him the ability. They gave him the ability to sign somebody, and he went down to Nashville and he found Paycheck, and uh, and then he brought him up to New York and recorded him. And then the label he hit with Paycheck a song called A11, but the label didn't want to pursue signing original artists. They were just more like a repackaging company.
I see.
And my dad was like, oh, okay, let's take this show down to Nashville. And me and my brother, and my mom and Paycheck all went down to Nashville. And my dad started a label, and that's how that all started. And then at some point, my mom didn't want to be there anymore, and she took us back to the Bronx.
Okay. Okay. I
Wow.
see.
It all starts to come together, but I didn't know how important all that was to the Bronx story.
No, no, I think it all ties in together because it's all going on during this, time in your life, most of which is in the Bronx, it sounds like, but it's still
I mean,
um
your formative years, they say you are who you are going to be for the rest of
yeah,
your life. By the time you're like 9 or 10, so
that's right.
pretty much. And I always, that I never like I shoot a lot of TV shows, and like Evil, the TV show that I just finished.
Oh yes.
Probably the last week of the shoot was up at the college up there. That's used to be an old NYU buildings, but
Oh, Bronx Community College.
yeah, we
Yeah.
and we used to all play up there. It was another place to explore. But every time I go up there to shoot, I drive by Davidson Avenue and I park in front of the building and I look up and see if I can feel any connection. And I do.
Yeah.
My mother lived on the sixth floor. We lived on the second floor. I spent half my life there living in my grandmother's apartment, she was a wonderful person. And my aunt who lived down the block, and all the kids lived in the neighborhood. It was just a great place to live. and I feel part of it forever.
Absolutely. Um, do you do you know how your mom, who, has these deep roots in the Bronx, first met your dad, who, I'm guessing he probably hadn't really spent much time in the Bronx before he met your mom, but do you know how they met?
And yeah, I do know how they met. My mom was a chorus girl at the Copacabana,
Ah,
and my dad, he was in the music business, so he was frequenting the clubs looking for talent, and he saw my mom in the chorus line, and he set up an audition, like a fake audition, just so he could meet her. And she came down, and she was dating this actor who most notably was in the movie The Longest Yard with Burt Reynolds. He was
okay, okay.
one of the inmates, and who was basically uh, Burt Reynolds's like best friend in jail, who ends up getting killed. And then, but anyway, and my dad said to her, he was like, "Oh, forget about him. We're definitely getting married," and they did. But she danced at the Copa and at the International, and she was a rockette in the traveling show rockette. It doesn't get more New York than that.
No, it
Girl,
doesn't.
girl from the Bronx dancing at the Copa, and
Wow.
when she was a teenager, she told me she dated one of the Fordham Baldies, which was that one of the gangs that was portrayed in the Warriors, which most people don't realize is loosely based on a true story. And
That's right.
the main gang that Cyrus was supposed to be the leader of was supposed to be the Savage Skulls. I mean, that's the way the real story went. The Savage Skulls were trying to unite all the gangs, which oddly enough happened a couple of years later with the Turbo Hydromatics, I think, with Africa Mambata.
Sure, 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 sure. Yeah, yeah. And there are a few attempts throughout the 70s, like at the Hoe Avenue Boys and Girls Club, there was a meeting, short-lived, but like at 71. But yeah,
Right. And
yeah,
when all that stuff was going on around me, it was just we were little kids,
yeah,
but everybody in the neighborhood we were all together with everything. We hung out with all the older kids. They were, I mean, not really older, but like late teens. We all hung out in the same places in huge groups. It was, very much like a I don't know, like I don't even know how to. I've never experienced anything like it afterwards, except for the hardcore scene, where
sure.
you the hardcore scene, and there would be Uncle Al, who was like 33, and I was 14 or 15, wanting to start a band, and he was in Murphy's Law, and he had like a 20-year-old girlfriend, and it's always people of all different ages in the hardcore scene, and that didn't even seem odd.
Sure.
It didn't seem odd as a kid being thrown over Big John's shoulder and being taken into a rumble.
That's right.
It wasn't like I was doing any fighting. I was just, he was just holding me up all covered in blood, saying, "This is the reason we're here." And
Sure.
so other kids were whipped into a frenzy, was whipped through an ass whooping on the Loring boys.
Yeah, I've heard people mention the Loring Boys in passing before, but never, just, you know, knowing of them, never run-ins with them. So it's interesting to hear, more detailed accounts of them before.
I mean, the
Yeah,
thing that was crazy was they weren't a huge band. I mean, they weren't a huge gang. They were
yeah, very
a
local.
little corner, a bunch of Irish knuckleheads, tough kids,
Yeah,
and they saw a Savage Skull, which is crazy to for them to even. But they were just like, "What are you doing in our neighborhood?"
yeah,
They were defending their turf, but it didn't seem like a very reasonable thing for them to do because the Savage Skulls came down on them like a ton of bricks that afternoon.
yes.
And that was probably the last time they ever yelled "spigot" of Savage Skulls.
Huh? Uh-huh. Um,
Stick. Wow,
so
I haven't heard that in so long. But when I was a kid, that was all. People said that all the time.
absolutely, absolutely.
There's a lot of
So
things people don't say anymore.
that's true. Um, so do you want to talk any about how the school at Nicholas of Tolentine was?
Yeah, I mean, my memory of going to St. Nicholas was I mean, I remember the nuns, and I remember the nuns hitting us with the yardsticks, on the hands, and no talking back and zero tolerance, and going to church on Sundays in Latin. They did the mass in Latin, which made it, you know, it's already pretty much incomprehensible to a kid, but you do it in Latin and it's just you just shut off. But but it was, it was a nice environment. It was all the Irish kids from the neighborhood. But I'm not really sure why we left St. Nicholas at Tolentine, but we ended up going to PS 91 after
Ah, I
that,
see.
which was a completely, flip the script type thing, which it was, mostly just other kids from the neighborhood where, as St. Nicholas at Tolentine was all the kids from the people who went to the church.
Sure.
Every once in a while, I run into Teamsters on set, and they're like, "Oh, it's the St. Nicholas of Tolentine kid." Yeah, and it's funny. And also, when I was a kid, my grandmother refused to call me Parris.
What'd your grandmother call you?
She called me different names all the time, like all Catholic or Irish names. And and I don't remember when it happened, but at some point the name Kevin stuck, and I became Kevin, and then my mom started calling me Kevin. And I was 5, 6 years old, and in the Bronx in the '60s, I hated my name.
Yeah.
I was like a boy named Sue.
Yeah, for sure.
So when people started asking me my name, I started saying Kevin because my mom was saying Kevin. It's like, you're also a little kid, you don't know what's going on. The only person who called me Paris after that was my father. And then that just kind of stuck. And I remember getting my high school diploma, and me and my girlfriend were looking at my high school diploma, and she looks at it and she goes, Kevin Mayhew. She goes, is this even legal? Her name was Meg. She was like, is this might be a problem for you like later in life or whatever. And I was transitioning to go to college at the School of Visual Arts. And she said to me, she goes, you got to go in there and explain this to them, and just, it's a fresh start. You got to stop this Kevin horseshit and use your real name. So we did. I registered at SVA, but we'd already put out the first Cro-Mags demo.
That's right. You're Kevin on that, right?
Kevin Cro-Mag, or it says
Yep.
Kevin Parris, Kevin Cro-Mag Parris, or something like, we, it was, even then it was kind of confusing. I was like, I got to put my real name on here, right? But yeah, then by the time we did AGGROS, all that was in the past. My Meg played such a major role in making that all change. And my mom and my grandmother jumped right on board immediately. I was amazed.
Wow.
I, I,
Wow.
I thought it would be twisting my grandmother's arm to do that, but I guess my father wasn't around anymore, so she wasn't holding a grudge against him.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Wow. So,
But PS 91, I could tell you, that was basically one of the, you asked what we did when we were kids. It's funny, I didn't answer this question immediately. We did what every kid in the Bronx did, which we wrote graffiti.
yep.
And that
I was about to ask you about that. Yeah.
it absorbed our days all day long. We would plan pieces that we would do in the schoolyard at PS 91. We lived, at that 183rd Street stop on Jerome Avenue was the layups, and
Uh-huh.
they parked the train right there at night. And when I would stay in my grandmother's apartment, I would sit in my bed, and I would, in the middle of the night, all of a sudden I'd hear, the scrape, and I would go and like sit on the fire escape and watch them paint, when I was really young. And then later on, like all of us, and my brother wrote graffiti. Every kid in school wrote graffiti. And we would, just plan. We would ride the subways. We would practice doing our tags like lightning fast. So you could be in a subway car full of people, and you could just like turn and like do it so fast that people wouldn't even notice you did it.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that I've noticed, they in the historicity of graffiti, they even call it graffiti artists. Nobody in the Bronx called themselves a graffiti artist. We were writers.
Writers. That's
It
right.
had nothing to do with art. It had nothing, certainly there are always people that are more artistic than others,
Sure.
and that obviously became a part of it. But graffiti wasn't about art, it was about fame.
That's right.
It was about it was about neighborhood fame. It was that other kids in other neighborhoods would know who you were.
Yep.
And everybody knew who we were because we got up, and there were different levels of fame.
Sure.
Like we actually had categories: the king of the outside,
Huh?
king of the inside, and the king of the outside for a long time was Comet,
Sure. Absolutely.
and the king of the inside for a long time was Kill Three.
Uh-huh.
And then people, started saying, "Oh, Kill Three, he's not that great because, Comet's the king of the outside. The outside's the big leagues." And so Kill Three changed his name. It became like this challenge. And Kill Three changed his name, and then just like over the course of like a month, he just bombed and like covered every car top to bottom. And he was the king of the outside. He like accepted that challenge. It was such a weird thing to like suddenly look up at the train and see just like top to bottom the entire subway going by. And we still all thought Comet was cool, but Kill Three took over. But that's what we did. I mean, we did that all the time. And like our hands were always covered in ink. Our clothes were always covered in ink. And we were little kids, so we didn't realize we were giving ourselves away to the cops.
Yeah, sure.
Riding the trains and the cops see you and you got all this ink on your hands, and they come up to you and they just start emptying out your pockets, and then they take you and arrest you, or beat you up.
Of course.
Like one time, there was this one station called uh, I told this story before, but like it's suddenly I forgot what the name of that station was. Not Burnside. It was further up. Anyway, there was this one stop that we always were told like never get off at this stop because the detectives are there. And I don't know what happened, but me and this guy who wrote Jack's Five, another little kid, we got off at that station and we were, gonna just go to the other side so we can go back. So, you have to keep going back and forth to keep riding inside. But we're going through, and these two detectives, plainclothes, they see us with the ink all over our jackets because we used to make these magic markers. We'd make our own magic markers. You'd take the eraser from school from the chalkboard, and it's made of like 5 or 6 felt strips, and then you would just loosen all the strings, and you'd pull off a felt strip, and you cut it in half, and then you'd wrap half of it in aluminum foil, and then you would tape it up really tight, and then you would put aluminum foil on the second half to make a cap, and then you would tape that up. But you always had to keep it facing up, and then you'd put Flowmaster ink in it, and then you'd make this nice fat juicy line. But we had these, and you had to put them in your pockets right
Yeah.
side up, and if you just tilted a little bit, like there'd be like a giant ink, But again, we were little kids, we didn't know, and we're walking through, and these cops see us, and they're like, "Hey, what do you got in your pocket?" And we're like, "Nothing." And then, of course, back then, cops, it's not like it is today where there are cameras and you can actually bring police up on charges. These cops just like grabbed us by the necks and like reached into our pockets, and no consent for a search. They just searched you.
Huh?
They found our markers, and the uh, the cops they take us up to the staircase. Like you always see these staircases with the bars on it, so people, like once you've paid, you can't get through, whatever. But underneath the staircase was a door, so the space underneath the staircase was like a closet. And they opened up the door and they threw us in there, and they closed the door and they put on a padlock.
Oh shit.
And then they left. They left us there. So there I am with this kid, Jack's Five, and he's like weeping, like, "Oh, when my dad finds he's gonna beat the shit out of me," and you know, and we were there, God knows how long, maybe 2 hours, and these cops come back and they're like threatening to take us to Spofford, and which was the juvenile home for kids,
Sure.
But at that time, going to Spofford was like a badge of honor. They used to
That's
give
right.
you this thing called a JD card, a juvenile delinquent card. And we were like, yes, we're going to get JD cards. But they pull us out and they're threatening us and they're like they smack Jax because he was crying or so he's like, shut up. Like what's your father gonna think when you show up with police at the door? And he was like, we're gonna let you go. And we were both like relieved. And then they took out our magic markers and they just started going like this, like whipping them at us, and like ink just went like across our face and across. And the whole time they're going, explain this to your father. Why your clothes are ruined. Explain this. That was their way of punishing us without actually taking us to jail or anything.
Sure, sure.
That kind of thing happened all the time. I mean, I had friends who had cops pull their pants down and spray paint their balls.
Huh?
That didn't happen that day, thank God, but we got covered in ink. And you go
Wow.
home, that's exactly, thank God my father wasn't there. I
Yeah.
I told I don't even remember what I told my mom, but getting covered in ink by cops and smacked around, and yeah, it was very different. Yeah, like,
What what
never
what'd you
wanted.
write?
I wrote Kato one. Like Bruce Lee was Kato in the Green.
Uh-huh. I see.
I was Kato one, and I was briefly before my dad took us away. I was in the original United Artists crew, which
Oh, okay.
crew, and it was because this kid Jive Kid, he uh, he was in the United Artists, and I remember being at home and him like coming and knocking on my door and saying, "Come with me." And we went to the layups, just the subway station with the trains parked. And they were
Sure.
like it was like, I don't know, 6 or 7 kids, and they had just painted the whole side of the train, said United Artists. And then there was this big cloud. And they were all signing the cloud like the original members of the United Artists. And Jive Kid like handed me a can and he was like, get in there, you're one of us. So I went down there and I did my thing, and probably 2 weeks later we were gone.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. That hey, that was
Unceremoniously. We just one day got up and went to went to school and didn't go to school. Just got in the car with my dad and drove away, and didn't see any of those kids ever again.
wow. Yeah, that was definitely the golden era of writing. So, man, who knows what pieces you might have produced if you'd stayed in the Bronx at that point.
I mean,
Um,
I still have a graffiti book from that time,
yeah.
and I remember over the years, like going through ups and downs and being broke, and hearing about graffiti being worth so much money, and like talking. I knew people who worked at galleries and downtown in Soho and stuff. And I talked to them about selling the pages one at a time, but ultimately I didn't do it. I just didn't feel like I could let go of it. But the book is pretty amazing. It's got pieces by Tracy 168,
R.I.P.
which is probably my favorite. Uh, he just like took a white opaque marker and did his like trademark Tracy 168 tag, and then like a pink or purple or something marker, and did a shading thing. But it was really awesome. And then there was like the front page has everybody signed it. Little Kindu, Tracy, in Kill Three, all those guys, everybody that was big in the Bronx at that time signed the opening page. And there's quite a few pieces to, like, because you'd go to like a layup, or you'd go to the train yards down at the end of Fordham Road. And if you'd go in there, we'd break in, we'd climb the fence and spend the night hanging out in the trains. And we would break the glass because they used to have this red glass that was square. And you break the glass and there was a fire extinguisher in there. And us little kids, we would get the fire extinguishers right away, because if any other kids tried to jump us and take our
Huh?
markers, we would spray them with the fire extinguisher. And
Sure.
and uh and we did that for years until they started having dogs in the yards. I remember, like, just towards the end when I was leaving the Bronx, that's when they first started having the dogs. But hanging out in the train yards was so much fun, just like getting into the trains and just writing and piecing and hanging out there all night with other kids. It was just, live growing up in the Bronx. Like I said, it was the Wild West. It was so much fun. And of course, my parents had no idea we were writing graffiti, even though,
That's right.
you know, even though like in our bedrooms on the walls by our beds, we would piece on the wall with magic markers. I guess they never put two and two together. Like go on the subway, hey, that looks just like what's on the wall in the bedroom.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, really, really incredibly vivid Bronx memories that yeah, there's a lot of oral histories we've been recording around both, street gangs and graffiti writing. So
Well, the
fits
graffiti
right
wasn't
in.
the primary. It was definitely the primary activity.
Yeah,
That's what consumed our days, and everybody did it.
absolutely.
I didn't stay in contact with any of those people. I mean, a lot of them, didn't. Two of my closer friends from that era just died, and then, nobody had cell phones and email and stuff, and returned 5 years later, and everybody's scattered.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Wow. So why don't you talk some about getting into playing music? And I know you've talked about it before, but kind of what inspired you to want to play music on your own, and the first instrument that you started playing.
Definitely when during that short period of time when I was down in Nashville, seeing all those concerts, seeing Rush and Van Halen and Aerosmith, that definitely opened my eyes to this idea of that there could be a life doing that kind of thing, but I didn't really think it was attainable.
Yeah,
And so I asked my dad for a drum. Like I wanted to, like, I didn't know what to ask for. So said, get me a snare drum. And he got me an acoustic guitar that I hated because it like had a picture of a bird on the pick guard. I thought it was like totally lame.
yeah,
And,
yeah,
but of course I started playing it anyway. And then I came back to New York to live with my mom and I started going to the High School of Art and Design.
sure.
And I don't know what it is about art schools, but it draws musicians. You read the histories of so many bands that from the Beatles to, any other big band, they all seem to have met in art school. And so I formed a little band in art school, and with the plan of being like Rush, Van Halen, and Aerosmith and stuff like that. But then I discovered Motorhead and the Sex Pistols,
Uh-huh.
and I found that they seem to be kind of like a gateway bands to being able to make music without being Eddie Van Halen.
Right.
And yeah, so I started writing a bunch of songs with this band from all kids from my school, and that was cool and fun. And the guy we used to rehearse in this rehearsal studio on 38th Street, where all the music stores, music rehearsal studios are. And the guy who owned the place wanted to manage us. We were all like 15 years old. He was like, "I'm going to get you gigs, and you can rehearse here for free. I'll be your manager." And I don't know, the band fell apart before any of that started to happen because I had discovered the Sex Pistols and Motorhead, and I started writing all these different kinds of songs. And the guys I was playing with in high school didn't like it. They didn't understand it. They didn't get it. So I went off and made a bunch of I did what kids did back then. I took a piece of paper and I wrote musicians wanted to start new band, and I went to the Xerox place and I went around to like CBGBs and Bleecker Bob's and all the music spots on the Lower East Side, and I started putting up flyers, and that's how I ultimately ended up meeting the other member of the Cro-Mags that I formed the Cro-Mags with, and
Sure.
I had this batch of new Motorhead type songs, and that's how the band started. I sat down with him and I showed him all these songs, and you could see his eyes light up like, oh yeah, I can use this. I thought it was like, oh, this is really great. What great songs. We're going to start a band. It was more like, I'm going to use this. And basically, those songs were the foundation of the beginning of the band, and that's how that happened.
What was the first punk uh concert that you attended? Eh,
the first real punk show I attended was the Stimulators and the Bad Brains
I see.
at Max's Kansas City.
Sure.
I was listening. I was listening to the. I discovered Motorhead, and that was really changing the way I was seeing things.
Sure.
But I'd gone out to the Mud Club one night because I was, New York City. Another Wild West thing was that you could get into clubs when you were a teenager, kid. And I was going to Max Kansas City when I was 14.
Wow.
Danced when I was 15. I would just go to these places and uh and I was walking around the Mud Club one night and I heard the Sex Pistols playing through the speakers and I was like, oh, what is this? This, I mean, just everything about it, like Johnny Rotten's voice and the guitars, and he was screaming through the speakers. And I just was like, this is it. I got to know what this is. And I saw, a group of punk rockers standing there, and I walked up to them because I figured they must know who
Yeah,
this is.
sure.
So I walk up to them and I go, "Who is this?" And they were like, "Sex Pistols, dick." I was like, "Oh, thank you very much for that information." And I ran with that, and I went to school, the next day, and we had three punk rockers in our school that always hung out together. So I went up and asked them about the Sex Pistols, and I asked if I could borrow a record. If you have a Sex Pistols record, little did I know that they only had one record.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
I asked, "Can I borrow it?" And the guy said, "Yeah." He seemed like, "Yeah, I'm gonna warp this kid's mind." And after I returned the record a couple days later, like loving it, I remember like one of my friends, his friend Kenny Kirsch, one of my kid friends from the neighborhood, rang my buzzer and like I was playing the Sex Pistols and he was coming up the stairs. It was probably reverberating around the hallway as he was climbing up the stairs. And he came in the door and he was used to me coming over to my house and listening to Yes and Rush
Uh-huh.
and Aerosmith and Van Halen. And there was the Sex Pistols and he walks in, he's like, "What the hell are you listening to?" And I was like, "It's awesome, right?" And he was like, "No," he just did not like it, did not get it. So there was kind of like a little divide there. And I think that's what pushed me towards, going out at night and looking for some way to make this kind of music. Unfortunately, or fortunately or unfortunately, I met somebody who understood and recognized something in what I was doing musically enough to, you know, uh, form a band together, and we made a mark.
Absolutely.
It was the Cro-Mags, and that was my high school band.
Absolutely. I know. And I know that I think I have read before there were multiple multiple very cheesy names before the Cro-Mags was
Yeah,
landed upon, right?
yeah, most notably the Bald Eagles. That was the name that really came out right away. Because there was, my band member had this idea that he wanted like to make a menudo type band, like, but not with Puerto Ricans, with skinheads. He wanted it to be like a kid skinhead band. And you had to be, menudo had this thing where you had, once you reached 16, you weren't in the band anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that was kind of going to be the idea. I guess he was 14 or 15 at the time, and I think I was 16 at the time. And so when you're 16, 2 years probably seems like a long time, but I guess he didn't realize that he would age out really quickly too.
Yes.
So ultimately, that was what this idea he had in his head, and he just superimposed that idea over my songs, and the Cro-Mags were born. And of course, that whole thing of the age thing didn't really work because I turned 17 the next year and I would have been out. Like that's one of the jokes I used to always say. There was like this laundry list of things you had to be in the band, or that's
Sure.
what he said. He goes, "Okay, this is the way the band's going to be, and to be in the band, you can't be older than 17. Well, except Paris, and you have to be a skinhead. Well, I mean, except Paris, and like I was exempt because I was writing the songs, but it was all fun, sitting
Yeah,
around talking very, very seriously about what we were going to do. Of course, not ever being able to actually know what was going to happen and the impact we were going to have, but we took it just as seriously as if we knew that. And I'm sure everybody in every band did that and didn't have the same impact. So it would have looked funny seeing the two of us sitting in a bar at like age 14 and talking about how we were going to rule the world.
Uh,
We probably could have if we, if we had stuck together, but we didn't.
I
And
know.
that's just another story.
It
But
is.
all roads lead to where you are, and I couldn't be happier than where I am now. I just made the best record of my life. I made it all on my terms. I just wish I had broken away much longer and followed, which I thought I was doing in the beginning. When I was putting out that flyer saying I want to start a band. I have all this music. I need a band. I need a vehicle for my music. And at that time, it just the only way to do that was to have a band.
That's right.
And you don't know how long a band is going to last, and you don't know how long it's going to affect your life. And I didn't know, I wasn't sophisticated enough to know that I should have vetted my bandmates better. Uh, because you go through life, especially when you're young, assuming that everybody you encounter shares your moral compass and your dreams and your vision of the way things should be. You just assume other people are decent, and you don't realize that you can encounter a lot of indecent people.
Sure.
I unfortunately teamed up with those guys.
Yes. Um, so do you want to talk some about how the name Cro-Mags was eventually landed on? If there's much of a story behind that.
There certainly is a story about it. The earliest origins I know, I've heard, you know, from the very beginning was that there was some roadie for Black Flag who wanted to start a band, and he, just like everybody else talks out loud, never tell anybody your plans because there could be somebody around who will steal your idea. But
Uh-huh.
he wanted to start a band called Cro-Mags, and Harley heard that, and he just appropriated it, and I guess at some point he tried to form a band called Cro-Mags, and he was trying to form. When I met him and we started playing together, he had two other bands.
Sure, sure.
He had left the Stimulators, which was like the hot band in town.
Yeah,
And he was like very charismatic. He was like a little, science fiction monkey or something. And there was a lot of expectation of what he was going to do after he left the Stimulators. So he was just really trying to do that, figure it out. And he was playing with everybody in town, trying to land on something that people expected him to do. But it looked more like he was depending on them to deliver the goods. And then he ran into me, who was a guy who was on fire and had a bunch of songs. And when I first met him, I went and played at his aunt and niece's house, who
yeah,
was the guitar player of the Stimulators. And
sure.
he'd already tried, to get together a couple of bands. And like when I sat down and I picked up a bass and I played World Peace and Life of My Own, like two songs from Major Pearl, like right that day. And the thing that, in retrospect, I can see it now, like him and Denise just started talking about me as if I wasn't sitting there. And Denise was like, wow, this is it, Harley. This is going to be a band,
Mm,
like because he had obviously been trying to do it, and nothing was really coming together or working out, or wasn't up to the expectations of what they thought he would do. And there I was, and then they literally superimposed that plan of doing the Cro-Mags over this, but it wasn't even right away because that band Cro-Mags that he was trying to form was still together at that point.
uh-huh.
We started writing songs, and at some point they played a gig, and I went to the gig with Harley. We went together, and I saw it. And he all along he's like, "Oh, don't worry about it. This is a whole other thing. It's not working out, so we're just going to play a gig, and then that's the end of that band." And that's what happened. That band played that one gig, and then they were over. And then the word Cro-Mags never came up. It wasn't like he tries to revise history now and says, "Oh, I always had this dream, this vision to start the Cro-Mags, and I did it." And but it wasn't when I met him. He didn't say to me, "Okay, we have a band. now we're called the Cro-Mags, and this is the plan. And I made this demo. There was no demo that he claims to have made. We just started working on my songs, and we called it the Bald Eagles or this or that or nothing.
Yeah.
We just kept writing and writing and working on music. And then at some point, I used to say to him, "Oh, that name Cro-Mags is really cool. Why don't we use that?" And he was like, "No, that's a whole other band, and that's over." And he used to fight it and get mad at me. And then also at some point, the manager of the Stimulators came forward and was like, "Oh, I want to manage Harley and make him like a solo star or whatever." So they went in the studio and recorded a demo, or it wasn't even a demo. He's got me calling it a demo now. It was supposed to be his solo album. And and I guess this guy wanted Harley to sign a management contract, and I guess Harley just agreed. He was just agreeing to get things done, and then once the thing was recorded, he refused to sign the management contract. So this guy held the tapes for hostage, and so he never signed. So that record never came out. But Harley had a cassette of it, and he would play it to me, and there was one good song on it,
Yeah.
uh, that "Don't Tread on Me." And I remember saying, "Well," I said, "Well, since you're not doing the solo album," because I was annoyed anyway that he was doing the solo album. Like, listen, we're doing a band, and I'm, like, why wouldn't we just record our own thing? I just never understood that. But after that was all said and done, I was like, "Yeah, this song is good. Why can't we play this?" He's like, "No, that's my solo album. That's a whole separate thing." Like I always heard that, "Don't worry about this other band." And then he started MOI
Uh-huh.
with John Joseph and Doug, and like that was a whole other band. That was like it was his second attempt at making his Skinhead Dream Band, but that wasn't called the Cro-Mags either. It was called MOI. So anyway, at some point, I finally got him to agree to play the song "Don't Tread on Me," and then I also got him to agree to use the name Cro-Mags. I kept saying, "That's so stupid for you to say it's another band. Nobody, in 5 years, no one's going to know about some band you played one gig with. Who, like,
Right.
let's just use the name." And he finally agreed. So, flash forward all these years later, and you read his version of the story. He's like, "I always want, I was starting this band, and then Parris joined." And I was like, "No, no, no, no." And he tries to like backdate himself and push me to
Sure.
1983, which is ridiculous because I graduated high school in 82. And he used to
Oh, okay. Yeah.
come to my school after school because he didn't go to school, and he'd meet me out in front of school. And like I run into people from high school, like, "Yeah, I remember when that guy used to show up and like wearing no shirt in front of high school." Like, it's just like the dates just don't work. But I've said it before. The only way for him to go forward, there's really no way for him to go forward with the Cro-Mags, honestly. Because how do you go forward without the primary songwriter? So
Yeah.
he manufactured this whole story, where the whole timeline is different, and the whole and he marginalizes me, and the fact that I wrote most of the songs doesn't seem to be important to him, but that's the only way he could go forward. And so he did, and that's what narcissists do. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. And by the time Age of Coral came out, some of the songs were what, like probably 6 years. You'd been working on them for 6 years already, right? And you'd written some of them maybe 5 or 6 years beforehand, right?
yeah, I'd say five, maybe 81,
Yeah.
1980, 81. It was like one of those, like where the school years were 80 into 81 and then 81 into 82.
Sure.
So it was probably in junior year, probably 80 to 81.
Oh,
And I mean, and I'd written World Peace and Life of My Own even before we met. So I'm not even sure how long before I was putting up those flyers I'd written those songs, because I did try to play those songs with my former band, but they just
they weren't on board, right?
weren't on board.
Did you originally write those on bass? Because I know, after acoustic, you didn't really take to acoustic. I think from what I remember reading elsewhere, you took a bass, really for a little bit. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, what really started appealing to me was Chris Squire from Yes and Geddy Lee from Rush. I just thought that was more manageable than being Eddie Van Halen, I guess,
Sure, sure.
which is naive because playing like Eddie Lee is no easy task.
That's
But
right.
I got a bass, and I started playing bass, and and all the songs I wrote for Reported Missing were on the bass. That was the other band that I was in. And when I started trying to write those Motorhead type songs, they were written on the bass, like World Peace, like
Sure.
dun 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 get right in. To me, that was like my version of Motorhead. Like it wasn't influenced by punk rock at all. It was influenced by Motorhead.
Yeah.
Like I don't think any of that music really. When I heard the Sex Pistols, like the growl and the scream of the guitars was definitely something I really liked. But I wasn't even playing guitar yet. I was still playing bass, and Motorhead was really the thing that drove me. And I wrote a lot of the. I mean, to this day, I mean, my new record, the AGGROS record, I wrote, I'd say half the songs on the bass. I still play bass.
Sure.
I just whenever I sit down and play an instrument, during that time I'm playing that instrument, that's what I play. I'm a bass player when I play bass. I'm a guitar player when I play guitar. I'm a piano player when I play piano. And I just try to immerse myself in that instrument. And that's the best way to record. Because if I write a song on a guitar and then it comes time to play the bass on it, I don't just pick up the bass and try to figure out what to do. I only play the bass for a while. And then
Sure.
I apply that instrument to the song and think of a way to make it a bass song. Or if I wrote it on the bass, I try to think of it a way to make it a guitar song.
Sure.
And that way I can play that role. I mean, I've been playing for a long time. So to me, bass was my first instrument. So it's not like I have to pick up the bass and try to be a bass player. I am a bass player.
That's right. Do you still have that first bass that you?
No, oddly enough, I always say guitars are for life, but during a breakup, that bass was in the apartment, and I think I told my ex-girlfriend at the time, I was like, keep it, and with the hope that she'd actually play it. And I don't know
Yeah.
if she did, but I spoke to her recently, and she says she still thinks it's in her parents' house. And
Wow.
yeah, I would love to see it. It was a really cool bass. It was clear, like it
Huh.
was made of plexiglass, and it had some kind of like crazy lightning bolt shape. Not really literally a lightning bolt. It's called a Renaissance bass, and I loved it. It was great. But I think I'd already transitioned over to guitar. So when that happened, it was just kind of like I was focusing on guitar. So I just let that bass go.
I see. I see. Where did you get that bass in New York City or were you in Nashville when you got that bass?
Uh, I got the bass at Sam Ash in New York on 48th Street.
Okay. Okay. Sure. Yeah.
When Sam Ash was a single store,
Sure.
where it became the supermarket.
Yes.
And they're all going out of business right now. They're
No,
having going out of business sale. I mean, I hate to wish anybody, bad in their business, but nothing could be better than the music superstores just disappearing.
absolutely.
Quality of musical instrument manufacturing has suffered tremendously in the past 20 years since the Guitar Center phenomenon, where they had to suddenly manufacture like an astronomically larger number of instruments every year to fill these superstores, and the
Uh,
quality of the instrument just cannot be maintained.
that's right. That's right. And did you get your first electric guitar from that same store?
I did.
Yeah.
I did. I went to Sam Ash and I got this one, which
Uh-huh.
is my primary guitar. Every Cro-Mags song was recorded with this. Almost every Cro-Mags gig was played with it until it failed on the last tour. And I just ended up using some $300 Strat cover copy that the other guitar player had. And, I've said it's like one of the only compliments Harley ever gave me was when this guitar died, we were both kind of like, oh no, this is the sound. What are we going to do? And then I ended up going on stage that night and playing this like blue Fender Strat copy. It cost $300 that the other guitar player bought in the store, just to have a backup guitar. And we walked off stage that night, and Harley looked at me and he goes, I guess it wasn't the guitar. And that was a very uncharacteristic compliment. He's not the kind of person who acknowledges. anything positive about other people. So I was a little taken by surprise. I almost started saying to myself, what does he want? I think he just wanted me to keep playing music with him because he could see that I was fading.
Yeah, yeah.
But I quit the band very soon after that.
Shortly after that, yeah. And that guitar is 1981 model, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, I've tried to look it up, but it was either 80 or 81 because
Something like that.
you never know
It's
how long a guitar sits in a store. But
that's right.
I bought it in 81,
But yeah.
which is also telling of when the band started because when I started in the Cro-Mags, I was the bass player.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
I got this afterwards because we were doing little musical chairs, and I, my role was to play guitar, so I jumped in and I played guitar, and he jumped to bass, and there was a time where he was the drummer and I was the bass player, and then we found a bass player, so I switched to guitar, and he was still on drums, and then it just kept doing that, and at some point I went and saw Frontline play at CBGB's, and I was looking at them, and the drummer was great, and I mean the whole band was great. I really like them. They're a really good band. It's too bad they never made a proper record, but Mackie was the drummer, and I noticed right away. I was like, I know that kid
Yeah,
because from skateboarding, and there used to be these ramps on the Upper West Side in Riverside Park, and he used to skate over there, and we had ramps in my neighborhood on the east side, uh, right by the FDR Drive.
sure.
It's kind of like an unwritten law, like you don't go skate somebody else's ramps in their neighborhood. It's like that turf thing.
Sure.
But I still went over to Riverside Park and skated those ramps, and I guess because I was just so persistent and such a crazy skater, they let me skate. But I met Mackie there, and we palled around there, and a little while later I see him at CBGB. So and he's good, and there was nobody good at that time. I mean, me and Harley, we didn't play with it. He played drums.
Sure.
I've often said that there wasn't like this huge stable of musicians. It was just like a handful of kids on a street corner.
That's
And
right.
some of us played instruments, and the whole scene was basically uh, drawn to those few musicians, starting bands. Like there was, Kraut and, like Doug Holland was an anomaly. He could
Sure.
play guitar really well. Like, cause, like me, it's not like he was influenced by the Sex Pistols initially. He was influenced by, Led Zeppelin.
Sure.
Doug, I think Doug just posted something on Facebook, like his ticket stubs from seeing Zeppelin 4 nights in a row at the Garden.
Wow.
He wrote something like, "What were you doing on this date in 1977?" And he goes, "I went and saw Zeppelin 4 nights in a row." So he was like one of these guys who bought a Les Paul because of Jimmy Page.
Sure.
And that's, and a lot of music and art or any kind of thing is created with, a different origin story than where it ends up. People
Right.
think, oh, like people always say to me, like, what hardcore bands were you influenced by? I was like,
None.
there weren't any hardcore bands when I started writing these songs. When I was writing the Age of Coral, I was influenced by Motorhead,
Yeah.
and then subsequently, very during the process of writing these songs, I discovered the Stimulators and the Bad Brains. But I had already written World Peace.
Sure.
That was a Motorhead song to me.
Sure.
But yeah, this whole idea that that things start in one way and they end up another way is just the nature of the way things are. You know, I've also said this before, but like the Sex Pistols, I think they all wanted to be like Bowie.
Yep.
And then it turned out to be like the Sex Pistols, and I wanted to be like Motorhead and Rush, and it turned out to be Cro-Mags. That's just the nature of art. You sit down to create one thing, and it becomes something else because you get in the way.
Yeah. And like Motorhead wanted to be like Chuck Berry, like they weren't intending to play anything, punk or metal or anything at all. They were rock and roll. So,
Exactly.
um, but
And that's cool. That's great. That if everybody just sat down and said, I want to be like Chuck Berry, if Lemmy had made a band that sounded just like Chuck Berry, music wouldn't have moved forward.
That's right. That's right. And I know you're obviously wearing a Kiss shirt, which I imagine for this interview has, of course, multiple meanings with Ace Frehley being from the Bronx and all. But was Kiss very formative for you musically?
Absolutely. That summer in Nashville, where I went to all those concerts, I saw Kiss. I think it was the Destroyer tour.
Oh, sure.
And that was, like seeing that was, I could have not ever go into another rock concert in my life and I'd have seen all of rock and roll that night. It
Wow.
was just the most insane, epic, heavy, great songs. People, I don't know why it is, people like to marginalize Kiss because of the makeup and the act, but they were just dressing up their music in a
Uh-huh.
way that they thought would be more entertaining. But what nobody would have watched Kiss if they hadn't written Detroit Rock City and I'm gonna rock and roll all night and party every day and all those great epic albums, God of Thunder. I mean, they were just a fucking great band. And that day when I saw them play, I was like, holy fucking shit, they were amazing. And I saw their very last show, recently at Madison Square Garden.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And it was amazing. It was great. I did my best to ignore the fake guys. And
Yeah, sure.
I just looked at Gene and Paul because I had to, because it was the last time. And I really hoped because it was the last night that they would bring Ace out.
Yeah.
There was always hope for that. Me and my wife even discussed it. We were like, should we get tickets to this? I was like, yeah, if we find out that they bring Ace out or bring Peter out to sing Hard Luck Woman in Beth, I'll regret it forever. So we went and
Absolutely.
it was great.
Absolutely.
I still love Kiss, and I like in bands like Kiss and Marilyn Manson and Slipknot. Those they're important bands because they create a groundswell. They inspire people. They move our music forward, and
Sure.
they keep it in a context where people take it seriously in terms of big dollars and venues and things like that. And a lot of smaller bands may not believe that's important, but it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As far as recording goes, you've obviously recorded a lot, but just uh for I guess the sake of getting everything right historically, was the Age of Coral demo, was that the first recording experience you had, or had you recorded anything before that?
We had recorded with Don Fury, very. Uh, I can't even say how long it was, but Don Fury had kind of like a rehearsal studio where he would run a tape while you rehearsed. So
Oh, sure.
we went in there and he would kind of sit behind the board. It wasn't like it ran the whole time. You
Yeah.
would rehearse and he'd say you want to record something, and we recorded um, one set at the time, which was a song that became Seekers of the Truth, which was called um, Back to Square One. And then we recorded, I think, Show You No Mercy, and we recorded World Peace and Life of My Own. And when the session was over, I don't know how this happened. Mackie ended up with the tape, and then he said at some point, "Oh, I lost it. It was in a box. I've lost it." And then many, many, many years later, uh, it ended up. I guess he found it and he put it out. And there's a couple of good songs on there, but that wasn't like a proper recording experience. We
Sure.
didn't we didn't like spend time miking things. We weren't listening to sounds. We just kind of like went in there and played, and Don did his thing, and it just happened to sound really good.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
just sorry, I take that back. Nothing just happens to sound really good when you're dealing with somebody as experienced as Don Fury. It sounded good because he had the room set up properly.
Sure. Um, so what was the first like full recording experience like for you? I mean, uh,
It was weird, It was with not Jerry only, Jerry Williams, uh, who we all knew from around. He uh, he recorded some Bad Brain stuff at 171A, and he did a lot of recording, and everybody knew him. He was just a friend of ours, and it was, it was really kind of like slopped together. Like I didn't have a guitar amp. I was
Uh,
still playing through my bass amp. I had a acoustic bass head and
oh
a
wow.
and a custom PA speaker, like with four tens in it, and I used that as a guitar amp. And and when we showed up to the studio, Mackie was just standing there, and we're like, "Where's your drums?" And he goes, "You never called me to arrange picking them up, so I didn't bring them." And we're like, I'm literally standing there looking at him like, "Are you kidding me? If you didn't have a way to get your drums here, you should have said something. I'm the bass player. I brought my bass amp. I mean, I'm the guitar player. I brought my bass amp. That's
Yeah.
just you bring your thing. And if you can't, you say something. But that was the way Mackie was back then. He just was not cooperative. And so we had to scramble. And Jerry was like, "Oh, there's a drum set like in these, a lot of times in New York to save space, people just build shelves by the ceiling and just
Sure.
stuff up there." So he said there is a drum set jammed up there, and there was some cheapo piece of shit drum set, and we pulled it down because the idea of going, you're paying for studio time,
Yeah.
kids paying for studio time, mostly
Yeah.
me paying for it. I think me and John Joseph paid for it. I paid for most of it, but he actually came up with a couple of $100. And so we bring this drum set down and we set it up, and it just looked like a piece of junk. But oddly enough, it sounded great. And in retrospect, I'm really glad Mackie didn't bring his drums because he used to play like this piccolo drum snare.
Yeah.
Like
Sure.
the snare always sounded like beep, beep. The world piece would have been like ding, 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 ding. And so it had a really fat snare sound, which I really loved. So I was, ultimately I was happy that it turned out that way. And getting the sounds and trying to figure out how to record, and knowing how we rehearsed, loud, and trying to figure out how to manage that. It was definitely, and recording on tape. And we had a couple of hiccups. Like we finished the entire session and we mixed it, and somehow some tone got printed on the tape,
Huh.
and Jerry broke the news to us the next day. And I was like, "Oh my God." And and I also was spending summers in Nashville, and we had scheduled the recording session to be like right before I left. And I was
Uh,
like, "Fuck, we have to re-record all this." So we went in the next day and just did it all over again.
wow.
And but I couldn't be there for the mix. And so and we had just mixed it the night before. So I kind of felt like Jerry had an idea of what we would do. But of course, when I wasn't there, Harley jumps in, and I went away for the summer, and like whatever it was, 2 months later, I came back, and I show up to CBGB's, and I walk into CBGB's, and I can hear this music playing in the speakers, and I kind of recognized it, and it suddenly hit me what it was, and it was our demo, but it was just bass. Like you couldn't hear the guitar at all.
Yeah.
You could hear the vocals, but it was like bass, like Harley mixed it. Harley comes running up to me and he's like, "Oh, it sounds awesome, right?" I was like, "Are you fucking joking me?" And so we went back into the studio and remixed it properly.
Wow. Wow. Oh my God. So, aside from your most recent recording with the AGGROS, which I think you're the proudest of, uh, what other album or demo or song are you proudest of musically as far as what you've produced over the years?
Um, I mean, by far my favorite thing is the Agros album. I mean, I just finished recording two new songs, and I record in increments. I record one song at a time. I don't do what traditionally what you do is you write an album and then you go in and do a marathon session and you know, I I do each one at a time so the songs come out the way I really want them to come out.
Yeah,
And just listening to these two new songs, they're my favorite things that I've ever recorded.
for sure.
And I just feel like I'm on fire again, like I was when I was 15 when I met Harley. I always say that band's first album is really the result of their whole life up until that moment. You make that first album and it represents your musical life, everything you've done, like all the things that you've come to as a musician gets thrown onto to wax on that day. And the fact that I had this extremely long gap between playing music and then playing music again, where I had a whole other career, working in the film business for almost 20 years, where I didn't even think of myself as a musician for, I'd say for almost 10 years, all my equipment was in storage. I didn't
Yeah,
play at all,
yeah.
except for this tenor banjo. I had this in my apartment.
Wow.
It was weird, because I felt like I had been pushed out of music, that whole thing I told you about how like, I started a band, I wrote most of the songs, and this other person kind of superimposed himself over my music, and then proceeded to just an endless campaign, PR campaign for himself and against me. That by the time all those years had passed by, there was so many people that believed him
Yeah,
because he just said it over and 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 over. That when I left music, it just felt like I just needed to escape that kind of drain.
for
So
sure.
I didn't even take a guitar with me. I took this, and I
Wow.
didn't know how to play it, but I taught myself how to play it. And as a result, I had to write songs. So I wrote a song on it, and I wrote several songs on it. Just and it's a different tuning than guitar, so it was also a different musical experience. I couldn't go to these go-to shapes you do on the guitar. Like someone picks up a guitar and they play a G chord, and then they play a C chord, and then they play a D chord. But you can't do that on a tenor banjo. So you have to like literally find the sounds and the notes and the chords. And I ended up writing something that I never would have written before. And in a way, it was just kind of like my subconscious musical self pushing past my hesitance that I built up over all these years because I was musically beaten down by an infrastructure of narcissists. But uh,
Sure.
but the odd thing is one of the songs that I just recorded in the studio was one of the songs I wrote in my apartment on this. I transposed it to
Wow.
guitar and I tuned the guitar like the tenor banjo, and I started playing it on the guitar, and I recorded it with piano. So it's like a piano guitar duet. It's like a not an 8 minute long acoustic epic. I love it.
Wow. Wow. Well, I was gonna ask when we're gonna hear a hardcore banjo song if that was in the works.
I considered recording parts with the banjo, but I tune my guitars differently, and they're tuned down, and
Yeah.
then once they're tuned down, then I tune them like a tenor banjo, so they're tuned even lower.
I
So the kind of strings and the setup of banjo is wouldn't be able to hold those lower tunings, and I could try to figure out a way to play it higher, but the way it sounds on acoustic is great, because it's music. It's a series of nice chords that fit together, and it's got dynamics and builds and all that kind of stuff, and it doesn't necessarily need the origin instrument. I've actually learned how to write differently in all those years that I wasn't playing music, because I basically just intellectualized music instead of playing it. The way I
sure.
used to just brute force myself through chords, now I think about music a lot more. And I've written, parts that were on the AGGROS album were written on the piano. And then I just started playing them heavy, but the chord voicings are just a little bit more interesting and they're a little bit less guitar-like. And that's what happened with the banjo thing.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It's
Uh
not like, to me, it's not even that different than anything else I've ever made before.
sure.
because I try to make it dark and interesting and compelling musically. I always feel like if every song doesn't have something in it that surprises you, musically surprises you, then it really hasn't served its purpose. I mean, you can continue to write the same song over and over and over, like so many people do, but I just can't bring myself to do that. That's what I always appreciated by somebody like the Police.
Yeah, sure.
They did basically continue to do the same thing, but there was always something very surprising. And that's what I always loved about them. And that's what I love about Led Zeppelin.
Absolutely.
And even King Diamond, King Diamond always manages to do something that you've never heard before. You're like, the hell is this? And so not that that's my primary goal, but if I feel like if a song doesn't have something in it that makes you go, oh, I've never heard that, uh, I won't record it.
Absolutely. And what about live music? I know, every musician, has a different as far as experience of, recording versus live music. Some enjoy both, more or less equally. I mean, but are there shows that have really been important for you musically, live shows, um, you playing in, of course.
Um, Not really. I mean,
Yeah,
I enjoyed I enjoyed playing live. I do enjoy playing live. I can't think of any individual show except for maybe, actually, now that I think about it, uh, the first AGGROS show at St. Vitus was a big surprise to me because, I hadn't played in a long time.
yeah.
The music was being extremely well received, but I still didn't know what the live thing was going to be like because also the guys that I was playing with had never met.
Oh, I see.
And
Wow.
so uh, the drummer Cobbs, who plays on the record, we played together for a couple of years, and I constructed a lot of these songs while we were playing together. But we could, and we, at the very end, we finally managed to record three of the songs that are on the album. But that ended up destroying our relationship because I had a vision and a method, and he didn't want to use my method. And
Sure.
at some point, I just said to him, "Listen, I'm not getting what I need out of this situation." And then I said, so I started packing up my stuff to leave. And then he was like, no, 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 what do you want to do? And I said, well, okay, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to map out some songs, but let's start with one. I want to map it all out to a click because the song has, it's 8 minutes long. It's got a million tempo changes. And when I say tempo changes, I don't mean a tempo change between parts. I mean tempo changes within the part.
Uh-huh.
A verse could be like at tempo 97 and then go to 98 and then go to 96 and then change to the chorus and drop down like a few clicks. And then when it comes back to the same verse, it might go to that higher one. And I ascertained what tempos would be based on the way we played them live in the studio. I would edit together many live performances of us playing in the rehearsal studio to where they felt absolutely perfect. Then I would take a click and I would figure out what tempo we were playing every section. I would be like, oh, look, we actually, in the second half, we start to go slower. So we would program that. And if you saw the click map for Chaos Magic, I looked at it recently and I was like, no wonder Cobbs thought I was crazy. Why do we have to do this? Why can't we just make it the same tempo? I was like, because that's not what you do when you actually play it. I
Sure,
want the
sure.
song perfect the way you're supposed to in a recording, but we breathe when we play, and I can map how we breathe. People always say, "Oh, playing to a click, it's not natural. It doesn't feel alive." Well, of course, you can program that.
Yeah,
And then you can play, around the click. You can play. You can let the click breathe. And when I tell people that the entire album was played to a click, they can't believe it. They're like, "But I hear you speeding up at the end." I'm like, "Yeah, I programmed that." So I got Cobbs to agree to do that, and we did that, and he hated it for some reason. Uh, Instead of just like listening to it back and being like, "Wow, this is great, we did something special," he was just mad at me. So we stopped playing together, and then the pandemic happened, and then he moved away down to New Orleans and then ended up in South Carolina. So when it came time to play live, he is on the record. So
Yeah.
I wanted him to have the opportunity. I also, wanted him to see that all that work that was done in his rehearsal studio actually amounted to something worthwhile and that he should be involved in it. So I started driving down to North Carolina. It was like 10 hours to his place,
Wow.
and we'd rehearse for like 2 days, and then I would come home, and then like a month later I'd go down and rehearse with him again. So I rehearsed with him twice before the tour. And my piano teacher, uh, we didn't practice at all.
Yeah.
He's an extraordinary musician, like studied at conservatory in Germany, and he's great. And Chuck, I made videos for him. Chuck Lenahan from the Crumbsuckers. I made instructional videos, and he learned, how to play all the songs part by part by me playing them slow. So we got together 2 days before the show at St. Vitus, and we did two marathon rehearsal sessions, and we played to all the click maps that I recorded the album to. We all had in ears, and when we finished the first song and the audience just erupted into applause, it was such a relief. You never know. It's been a long
Right.
time, and they just loved they loved it. And when the show was over, people came up to me, and I heard a couple of times that night, "You guys are the tightest band I've ever seen live." And I was like, "That's
Uh-huh.
funny, 'cause none of us met each other before two before 2 days ago." So that was kind of like a landmark show, but then the rest of the shows on that tour were kind of the same. You know, we
Sure.
we were already a very tight unit. We're all really good at what we do, and it was great. The thing about playing the music live is always just this realization of your sensibilities, because it all starts, you sitting at home and being like, okay, if I play those two notes together, if I play those two notes together, or if I go there, oh wait, that sounds good. And the next thing you know, you have a riff. And this is like a
Right.
total personal experience. It's like panning for gold. You could sit there and pan for gold looking for a riff, and then you find a riff. And just because you go through that process doesn't mean you're going to find a great riff. Some people find great riffs, and some people find a lot of great riffs. But that whole experience of sitting there and doing this is completely personal. It's something you do in private, and you do it and it's the result of your love of music. And so if you do this for like 2 years and put all these pieces together into something cohesive, an album, and you put it out and people like it, that's the ultimate validation of all your creative sensibilities. It's the greatest gratification you can have. And then playing it live on stage is the second half of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's proof that all the arguing that I did with Cobbs, and even though he thought I was an asshole when we were doing those recordings, the results and the way people respond to those results is all that matters to me.
Absolutely.
And in
Um,
fact, like, it's just your personal experience, your personal, you know, uh, desires realized and accepted. But I mean, to be honest with you, it's only the first half that matters. Once I finish recording something, when I listen back to it and I say, that's it,
yeah.
that's really the end of the journey for me. All the rest of it just extra.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So do you want to talk us through some more of your guitars? I mean, you've obviously shown your mainstay guitar. Do you still have your first acoustic that your dad got you back in
Uh,
the day?
no, one of my dad was like cultivating a country singer at the time,
Yeah,
and she needed a guitar, so she ended up getting that guitar because I didn't really embrace it.
sure.
But we had a guitar in the house all my life. Um, this was always in our house. My dad referred to it as our house guitar.
Uh-huh.
If you can see it, it's a Martin
Yep.
D28 and 1958. And this has
Wow.
always been in our house. And I guess after my parents broke up, this somehow stayed in the Bronx.
Wow.
When we left, and when I came back, whatever it was, 5 years later, and moved into my mom's apartment, this guitar was there. And so ever since then, it's been mine. And this song that I just recorded, the banjo song, I
Yeah.
recorded this and another Martin D28, which I have, which I got during the pandemic. Because when I was a kid learning how to play guitar, there was this old cowboy uh, singer named Clyde Moody. He's actually an American Indian, but he still wore the big white hat and string tie. He was like
Sure.
6'5", really tall American Indian guy with a voice like a tuba. When he spoke, the whole room rumbled. But he would sit in my father, and he was a big star
Yeah.
in the 40s. He had probably the first million-selling country music song called "The Shenandoah Waltz."
Huh.
And so he and my dad, his career had long been past, and he was kind of like, I guess his music was popular before there was any way to make people aware of it forever. So his name had faded, but my dad respected him and gave him a job just basically hanging out in the lobby of his recording studio. And while he was hang out there, he had always had his guitar that said Clyde Moody in the fretboard because that's what all the country stars do in pearl. So he would teach me how to play on that guitar. And then years later, when I was on tour with Best Wishes, I found out that Clyde had passed away, and that was horrible enough. He was probably the first death that I'd really dealt with in my life. But I wanted to ask about the guitar, but I always felt guilty about it. I thought it was in poor taste to ask about the guitar.
Sure.
And then flash forward, 30 years, and the pandemic happens. And during, my father had passed away, and during the pandemic, I had to deal with my father's estate, and I had to find all these songwriters. And Clyde had passed away in '89, and I had to find some of his heirs. He was one of the songwriters, and I ultimately ended up calling all these people in the mountains of Tennessee. And 5 phone calls later, I get this guy on the phone, and he lets me know that he has Clyde's guitar, the one with the pearl in the, and he said he found it in a pawn shop. I guess his wife had sold it, and the
Wow.
pawn shop couldn't sell it because it said Clyde Moody on it. I mean, how crazy is that? Like, because nobody wanted a guitar with somebody else's name on it. But I was like, yeah,
Huh.
but it's Clyde Moody's name. So it was in pristine condition. And he bought it, and he was saying that he had arthritis now and he couldn't play it anymore, and that he was looking to sell it. And I said, listen, man, I'm not going to haggle with you. Just tell me how much it is, and I'll pay it. And we came to a price, and it was during the pandemic. And I said, what do I have to do to get you to hold it? Like, how much money do I have to give you as a deposit? He goes, nothing. Just tell me you're going to come and get it, and I'll hold it for you. And I said, well, I don't know how you're feeling about this pandemic, but I'll get in my car and drive right now.
Yeah.
And he said, okay. And I drove down to me and my wife drove down to Tennessee. We met him at a truck stop in the mountains. And we got the guitar right here, actually. Also, Martin D28.
Incredible.
And man, when we were at that truck stop and he opened this case and I saw the name,
Huh. Look at that.
I was like, oh my God, look at it shine, man. This thing,
Wow.
me and my wife were like, oh my God, it's in such great condition. And then I thought to myself, I heard my father's voice say, of course it's in good condition. That's the tool of a professional musician. Professional musicians take care of their tools. Guitars are for life. That's what my dad would
Uh,
say. Yeah,
wow.
it's a beauty.
It is. And it has such
1974,
a amazing history to it.
Martin
Oh,
D28, Clyde Moody, Shenandoah Waltz. And I used this and my other Martin to record my new song, which is called Fire Murder Story. But I have a feeling it's going to change titles.
Sure.
It won't come out till 2025. I'll put out another album 2025. Hopefully there'll be all kinds of different songs on it this time.
Wow.
With these guitars was a whole different experience. I, produced albums, and I produced my own albums, and I produced other bands' albums, and I'm trying to figure out different ways to record things, but I've never recorded an acoustic guitar,
Yeah.
oddly enough. So my engineer, Georgios, uh, he came up with some miking techniques, and we did that with one guitar. And then I just said to him, I was like, take out every mic you got. Let's just mic it to hell. And we did the second stereo tracks like that, and it just came out great. I'm really super happy with it. And I love that I can just do something completely different, and I don't feel like it doesn't fit.
Sure. Sure. Absolutely. And to be able to play one guitar that's been in your family, your whole life, and another guitar, like from the one of your first mentors on guitar, that's incredible.
Yeah,
Wow.
that was definitely a big part of it. I felt like I just wanted to underline Clyde with the song. Like I can't wait to like I have 2 more videos to make for this album, and I still already like I can't wait to make the video with playing Clyde's guitar.
Yeah.
This is my only other guitar.
Sure.
It's a 1976 Gibson Les Paul Black Beauty.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Look at that.
yeah, I love this. But this is a new acquisition. I literally only had the acoustic, the Martin, and the Bitch um, all my life until around the pandemic, and then I acquired the Clyde's Martin, and I also have a 1980 Fender P bass that I
Okay, sure.
play on all the recordings, and I have a G&L Rampage, which is actually kind of my main recording guitar.
Okay, yeah.
The Rampage is kind of was not a very common guitar. The only other guitar player that I know of note that uses one was Jerry Cantrell, or not was, he still does.
Sure. Wow. Um, well, so I have a final question for you, related to the Bronx. But before I ask that question, I know there's, obviously there's so much more we could talk about, and we didn't even touch on your music video directing career, and your film career in general. But yeah, just want to see if there's anything else you want to add to this particular oral history before I ask you the final question. I know there's other interviews that folks can go to learn more about some of those aspects of your life, but if there's anything else you'd like to add right now that we haven't gotten into, then now's the time to do so.
No, just I appreciate all the history, and I love talking about growing up in the Bronx, and but I'm very much a now and forward person, and I'm making music now, and I've made music in recent times, and that's really what I hope people will embrace. And there's an easy way to do that if you just go to the YouTube page, youtube.com/the AGGROS, AGGROS, and just subscribe. It's free. It doesn't interfere in any way. It doesn't send you like notifications or anything. But concert promoters, they look at subscribers and they decide whether they're going to book you based on how many subscribers you have. So if everybody who watches this clicks, you'll get me more gigs.
Absolutely.
And that's all I ask. And if you're interested, go to my website, aggros.nyc. It's not .com, it's .nyc. And you can get physical copies of the album that I worked on harder than I've worked on anything in my life. And on YouTube, you can see the videos that were all very, very very, very um, elaborate, uh, extremely. It's hard to put it into words. Like there's three videos, and they basically depict one long night. Uh, and the night is of the New York of my memory, of the New York that doesn't really exist anymore. So it was kind of hard to capture it. I tried to find places that reminded me of my life growing up here, or just the feeling of the way it felt at night walking around in New York City, or skateboarding around, or riding a bike around. And I tried to capture that in my videos, and I tried to capture that in my music. And I definitely feel if you like hard music, heavy metal music, hardcore music, what you'll get with my music is something very different. I think you'll get a slice of life. Uh, I mentioned to you earlier that being raised in the Bronx, you just have a very lasting regional identity, and I try to do that with the music and with the videos. And I kind of felt like I was just going to do that with this album, but I don't really know how to stop doing it.
Sure, sure, yeah. Yeah, it's a very a very appropriate segue to the question I was gonna ask. And actually it's I imagine it's gonna be a difficult question to ask because I think it's so all consuming in the music you put out, and they're still putting out. And the question is, how the Bronx, you feel, shaped you as far as your musical approach and musical vision goes.
Growing up in New York City, just in the 70s and the 60s, definitely it just makes a different kind of adult. It, the way you conduct yourself, the way you carry yourself, the way you protect yourself, the way you protect other people. Um, I wouldn't be who I am. My music wouldn't be the way it was if I hadn't, been buried in garbage by Big John in our clubhouse, and if I hadn't experienced all the things I did, I wouldn't have developed, what I call a New Yorker's heightened sense of peripheral vision. Like we walk the streets at night differently than other people. We see a block ahead. We see people walking besides us. And I just feel like the music I make is, even though I don't necessarily try to make it dark, it ends up being very dark and hard and heavy. And again, it just, I, like I always say, you can plan to make a kind of music and you get in the way. And there's no way for me not to get in the way of my music. And the Bronx was a big part of that. And growing up in Manhattan, as a teenager was a big part of that too. It was just an extension. In the 80s, the last real, era before New York turned into Gossip Girl and Sex and the City, when when you could have a storefront satanic church and a hardcore club right next to each other because the rent was so cheap and everybody could afford to live in extremely cheap apartments on the Lower East Side or squat a building. A lot
Uh-huh.
of people lived in squats. I lived in squats. When I was trying to get into the film business and I had no money and I was in credit card debt, I moved into a squat in Harlem on 127th and Morningside.
Wow,
It was basically a crack house,
sure,
and I lived there for as long as I needed to while I was learning camera to get into the camera business. And and I lived in, you just do what you live a different kind of life in New York. It's funny, I look back at it and I can't even believe it. When I was when I was 11, or me and my dad and my brother lived in an abandoned building outside of Houston. It was an old abandoned television station because we were
wow,
out of money, and we needed a place to live, so we like squatted this old abandoned building. And it fortunately it was like not like a decrepit building. I don't know what happened to the business, but like there was still carpeting and desks and all that kind of stuff. So it was kind of like we walked into some science fiction movie where all the buildings were still there but everybody left. And we lived there for a while we figured out how to go to school because we were on the run and we didn't have school records and things like that.
sure.
All these things shape who you are, but It's funny, I always think of myself as being from the Bronx.
Absolutely, absolutely, and definitely proud to count you among some of the most formative musicians to come out of the Bronx. So thank you so much, Paris, for taking all this time today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.